Hello, welcome to Virginia Time Travel, your portal to the Commonwealth's past, present, and future. The Civil War is a very popular topic here on this program, and understandably so. As mentioned in previous episodes, to actually study the Civil War in your lifetime would only go ahead and scratch effectively the surface of the conflict. Most historians of the time period would argue it would take probably at least 2 or 3 lifetimes to even get down to the bottom of it, and saying that you knew everything there is to know about it. But since immortality really isn't any one of our specialties, and the possibility of being like Doctor Who and regenerating a few dozen times over is out of the question, we have to go ahead and confine ourselves to perhaps particular areas of the conflict that we find interesting and appealing. And so it's on that point of interesting and appealing that we have our show for today. It deals with a topic which I have to admit I do find interesting and kind of curious about and would love to know more. And so joining me today, we have Kevin Knapp, who is a balloonist and is going to tell us about the Balloon Corps during the Civil War. So Kevin, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you for having me.
And I have to admit, the first time I ever saw anything about the Balloon Corps was during, it was like an 80s miniseries with Stacy Keach, and I think it was The Blue and the Gray.
Blue and the Gray.
And they had the Balloon Corps, and it crashed. But I thought to myself, that's brilliant. Why didn't they do it all the time?
The challenge in that, there's actually friends of mine from California who put a gas balloon together for the Blue and the Gray. In one scene, they were for the north, and then they put a cover over the envelope, and they were a balloon for the south. So there are a few of us who are aeronauts who share the history, and more of the historians are textbook historians. I have the advantage of being a rated hot air balloon and gas balloon pilot. My personal balloon is the modern Army balloon, and I've been sharing Army lighter than air history, which includes and starts with Civil War aeronautics, for 25 years.
Well, yeah, it's a fascinating topic, and so, in fact, just the other day I was mentioning it to somebody, and they had no idea this existed. And so, probably for most of the audience, they don't realize that balloons had been used during the Civil War, and perhaps understanding when did balloon technology, or just even using balloons themselves, became relevant. When did that all start?
Let's start with the basic history. The Montgolfier brothers, 2 paper manufacturers, were burning their scraps of paper, saw the smoke rise, thought if they can find a way to contain the smoke, they could fly. So they built an envelope out of paper, held together with buttons, crammed as much smoke in it as they could, and they flew. The first flight was manned flight was on November 21st, 1783. It was the first fire balloon. Again, they thought it was the smoke, not the heat, that made it rise. And the challenge became, once the temperature inside the envelope equaled the temperature outside or got colder, gravity works. And the balloon would descend, and that was the end of the flight. 2 weeks later, Professor Jacques Charles also launched a balloon in France, but this balloon was filled with hydrogen. That balloon was able to stay aloft longer, and the preferred method for flying for years had been gas ballooning, not hot air. The modern hot air balloon, as we know it today, wasn't developed until 1960 as a project for the Navy and other alphabet agencies trying to find a way to get in and out of denied areas.
Well, that's interesting. So with the balloons being used, with these gas balloons, was it something that militaries had been looking into as soon as, hey, this is the newest invention on the block, let's see if we can put a cannon on it?
On the first ascent, Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson were in France and observed it. And Benjamin Franklin overheard somebody next to him say, well, what good is it? His reply was, what good is a newborn babe? And he started talking about the potential for military applications then. And then Napoleon was the first to use balloons as an aerial observation platform in the Battle of Flanders in 1794, not long, just 1 year after the balloons were created. But balloons for aerial observation wasn't perfected until the Civil War.
Now, What made, I guess, both the Union and the Confederacy, but we hear a little bit more about the Union, so we'll start with them. What made the Union realize that using the balloon for observation was a brilliant idea? What inspired that?
Let's more about the history just prior to the war. Aeronauts of the time, John Wise, John LaMontagne, Thaddeus Lowe, the quest for the premier aeronauts was to cross the Atlantic. In order to raise funds to support their project, the aeronaut Thaddeus Lowe did a demonstration flight on April 19th, 1861, launching from Cincinnati, Ohio at 3:30-ish in the morning. He flew through the night, initially going west, and then climbing to altitude and coming east. The aeronauts knew upper level winds go from west to east. The common public did not. But he landed 9.5 hours later in Unionville, South Carolina, and was detained because 7 days prior, the shots were fired at Fort Sumter, and he was considered a Yankee spy. Detained not once, but 3 times as he made his way back north, the second time to protect him. But as he made his way back north, he saw the South mobilizing. Lowe was a patriot. He was for the United States, and he knew that he had the skills and the equipment that could be used to support the war effort, reducing potentially the total length of the war and the total number of casualties for both sides. So he came to the DC metropolitan area and did a demonstration on the National Mall in front of where the Air and Space Museum is today. Because the city gas works at the time where he inflated his balloon, Enterprise, is where the American Indian Museum is today. He filled his balloon, went up to an altitude of 500 feet, carrying a telegrapher in the basket with him, sent the first air-to-ground telegraph. There was a cable going from the balloon to the War Department to the White House. And his message to President Lincoln, I'm at 500 feet, this is what I can see, and I'd like to talk to you about how balloons can be used. Lincoln invited him to the White House, and his crew walked him like a Macy's Day Parade balloon, tied it off on the South Lawn, and he spent that evening and night talking to President Lincoln about how balloons can be used.
It's a fascinating situation there. I mean, and so for Lincoln, obviously, we do know that he was a very big proponent and admirer of technology, trying to move things forward, end the war sooner. And so, do we have any details behind that particular meeting between the two?
The discussions between the two, Lowe described portable hydrogen generators, which he later built, that were helped with the success of the Balloon Corps. He also talked about indirect artillery fire, the potential for directing artillery fire from above. Up until then, it's only been line of sight. And President Lincoln said, all right, go see General Scott about your balloons. So Lowe did, multiple times, but couldn't get past the gatekeepers. 3 weeks later, in July, President Lincoln wrote him a note. General Scott, please see Professor Lowe about his balloons. And that note is in the Air and Space Museum downtown. Lowe took that note and still couldn't get past the gatekeepers. So he went back to the White House, and President Lincoln put him in his carriage and escorted him, knocked the door down and said, General Scott, you will use the balloons, which made it a bit of a challenge. So they didn't teach ballooning 101 at West Point. This is new technology. The focus was on fighting the battle. How do we incorporate the balloons? How do we employ them? Who do we assign them to? The aeronauts were civilian contractors. Instead of being brought into the military as officers, as Thaddeus Lowe had suggested. But that's one of the challenges that would face the Balloon Corps throughout its tenure.
So for the Balloon Corps itself, the Civil War lasted 4 years, and were they regularly used, or was this sparingly, or was it just an East versus West thing? I mean, you don't really see, as you said, it's something that kind of gets relegated to maybe a paragraph. I mean, was this just something like they were with the Army all 4 years, or?
Well, the balloons supported the Army from 1861, July-ish of 1861, to June, July of 1863. Heavily used during the Peninsula Campaign, or initially after the Battle of Bull Run, the First Manassas. The balloons were positioned along the Potomac from Bud's Ferry to Edwards Ferry on multiple locations to go aloft and identify was the Confederate mobilizing. As everybody's catching their breath, trying to figure out, all right, what do we do next? And reports from the balloons made the people of Washington very comfortable or less concerned, because all the Confederates had to do was cross the Potomac and take Washington. Everybody was concerned. Initially, the balloons were assigned to the topographical engineers. They made maps of northern Virginia because there wasn't 7-Elevens to stop and ask for directions. Lowe and the aeronauts that he hired were teaching the military how to use the balloons.
Now, since being in a hot air balloon today, and I can only imagine being in a gas balloon back then, there were dangers involved, because nothing is 100% foolproof safe.
No, and people initially, any first-time experience, whether it's taking the training wheels off your bicycle and learning to ride without your training wheels, or learning to drive a car for the first time, your arms are locked and your head's spinning like Linda Blair in The Exorcist, and you're waiting for something to hit you, and now the window's down, the tunes are cranked, and you're not texting, but you're driving down the road. The more you do something, more comfortable you become with it. One of the questions that always comes up, what about the Hindenburg? Well, the Hindenburg didn't happen for years later. And as people, we generally go to a tragic or significant event, and that's all we remember. Well, most people are surprised to learn that North made over 3,000 ascensions with 11 different balloons, 4 personal balloons that the aeronauts brought with them at the beginning of the war, and 7 balloons that were built under contract for the Union Army. 3,000 ascents without incident. I have over 34 hydrogen balloon flights without incident, but everybody comes back to one.
Now, it's interesting that you said without incident, because directly behind me is a portrait. You see a balloon, and you see Confederate soldiers shooting at it. Now, was that a common occurrence where?
Very common, very common. This is a painting by Thomas Lovell showing the pickets of the South shooting at one of the balloons aloft. The balloons were the most shot at unit during the war. And not just up at the balloons, but when artillery fired trying to hit them, the units on the ground around the balloons or behind the balloons had to be careful because they became in the free fire zone. There's an area called a danger zone from treetop level to about 300 feet where rounds could hit the balloon, but you could have 100 rounds come in, hit the envelope, and the balloon would still stay aloft. The rounds weren't going fast enough to generate heat to create an explosion like one would see if you put heat to hydrogen today. But there were holes that were in the envelope that needed to be repaired and were.
It's always interesting to think about, because you would think that because you're basically just a sitting duck that they would have a much easier time, but you know.
Something else to keep in mind too, that the balloons weren't right on the front lines. They were near the commander's headquarters, 2 to 3, 5 miles behind the front lines. And from 1,000 feet or 3,000 feet, some of the balloons went as high as 5,000 feet. Each of the tether lines that were used for the balloons, and there were 3 that were used to make a stable platform, were a mile long.
Well, that's always interesting, because it completely changes your mindset. Now, when we think of the Balloon Corps, you said that it went all the way to pretty much almost right before the Battle of Gettysburg.
Yes, sir.
And so it kind of makes me wonder a little bit, why did the Balloon Corps kind of stop?
Well, again, remember, they didn't teach ballooning 101 at West Point. Balloons were used extensively during the Peninsula Campaign. Observations from aloft reported the Confederates withdrawing at Yorktown. Observations outside of Richmond helped the North when units were separated when the Chickahominy River flooded. But after McClellan was relieved, McClellan and Lowe got malaria during the Peninsula Campaign. But after McClellan was relieved, then we have Pope come in, and he did not want to use the balloons. And then Burnside at Fredericksburg. He didn't want the balloons to go aloft until the day of the battle. Another one of the challenges with the balloon corps were weather dependent. If the weather's great, we can go up and we can do everything that we say we can do. If the weather's not good, then we can't, and everybody's going, well, what good are you anyway? If we talk about Fredericksburg, we just dedicated a new historic marker just near the Phillips House on Monday, recognizing the balloons that were in what's called Lowe's Ravine, just by the Phillips House, where they went aloft during the Battle of Fredericksburg and the Battle of Chancellorsville. Now, at that time, Congress started doing internal investigations, trying to save money. This is costing. What's going on? And in cost-saving efforts, the focus was, where can we save money? And one of the places thought was the balloon corps. So instead of reporting directly to the commanding generals, as they did during the supporting McClellan and Fitz-John Porter and his subordinates, the balloonists were assigned directly to a quartermaster captain, Captain Comstock, who cut their pay and fired several of the aeronautic staff, to include Thaddeus Lowe's father, because he thought there was nepotism, but Clovis Lowe was the maintenance and logistics officer. So if you're in the middle of battle and you need supplies, equipment, you need to maintain the balloons, and you've just lost your maintenance and logistics officer, it becomes a pretty big challenge.
Yeah. Well, I could definitely do it. Now, you had said before, when we were talking just briefly about the blue and the gray, you had one scene where the Union had a balloon and then the Confederates had a balloon. Did the Confederates have a balloon corps?
Not so much a balloon corps per se. They had two balloons. The first balloon was the only hot air balloon or fire balloon used during the Civil War. It was a bag that they found. General Johnston had it, and he sent a message out asking for somebody familiar with the area near West Point, north of Yorktown. And Adjutant Captain John Randolph Bryan said, "Wow, that's where I grew up. I'll go volunteer and get out from behind this darn desk." He convinced General Johnston that he was familiar with the area through a map recon, and was surprised when Johnston said, "Report to the balloon." "I'll gladly get on a horse and scout the area, but I know nothing about aeronautics or ballooning." And Johnston said, "Well, you don't understand. You're now it." And he went aloft. Again, in a fire balloon, you have to build a fire here, dig make a chimney, and the heat going through the chimney fills the envelope. You tie it off when it's full, tie the basket to it, and you go aloft. They were using a single point tether. Now imagine, we talked about first time experiences earlier. Imagine your first time in a balloon and you're directed to make maps and observation. And on a single point tether, as the balloon or as wind is passing by the envelope, it's spinning. And you're supposed to make maps and you're spending more time holding on. But Bryan went aloft and said, "Wow, thank you, sir. I'm going to go back to my day job." And Johnston said, "You don't understand. You're our only trained aeronaut." So that he went up two more times. On the third time, word got out, Confederates had a balloon. They gathered around. Everybody was excited to see it. The single point tether, before it went through the windlass, was placed in a seaman's coil so it wouldn't get tied in knots. And one of the soldiers got a little bit too close and got his foot caught in the coil and was being dragged toward the windlass. He yelled for help, and his friend said, "I'll save you," and cut the line. The line went through the windlass, the balloon free flew. Bryan, fortunately, it came down in Confederate territory, but came down over the York River, and Bryan's taking his clothes off in order to lose weight to stay aloft. And when the balloon came down, it was damaged and unairworthy and was not used again. And Bryan gladly went back to his day job.
Wow.
The second balloon that the Confederates had is known today by most people as the silk dress balloon. The name of the balloon was a Gazelle. It was half the size of the Union's smallest balloon, which was 15,000 feet. The Gazelle was 7,500 cubic feet of volume. It was very porous. It went aloft for the first time on the 24th of June, 1862, outside of Richmond. E.P. Alexander was the observer going aloft in the balloon. The first time two opposing forces had aircraft in the sky at the same time was on the 27th of June. And on the 4th of July, after doing an aerial observation while tied to a tugboat, it ran aground and was captured. And that is the end of ballooning for the Confederates. They didn't have the money or the resources or the passion of an aeronaut like Thaddeus Lowe to make it happen.
If you lack certain things, it doesn't help. Now, one term you've been saying quite a bit, and it's one that I kind of want to know a little bit. You've been saying the term aeronaut. Mm-hmm. And I got to ask, how did that term come about?
Initially, we're talking about being in the sky, mm-hmm. In the air. Aeronaut is a title. If you're reading the books, you hear for Professor Lowe. Thaddeus Lowe was a self-educated scientist and inventor, and aeronauts of the time were called professors. They were professors of their craft. The term aeronaut didn't come along until a bit later.
Mm-hmm. Now, when we look at this entire time period of the balloons, what do you think the lasting legacy of this balloon corps is?
Well, you think over 150 years later, the military has more tethered aerostats for border patrol, target interdiction, working no-fly zones in Iraq and Afghanistan than we ever have. We have satellites doing aerial observation. The movie Bridge of Spies comes out tomorrow. We're talking about aerial observation. The lasting legacy of the Balloon Corps has to be the gathering and collecting of information. Thaddeus Lowe was recognized by the United States Army at its helicopter training facility at Fort Rucker. The airfield is named after Lowe for his efforts during the Civil War.
It's just a fascinating time period. And so now you do have a website that you have in Civil War BalloonCorps.com, and does this site, what does the site entail for people if they visit it?
It's under construction. I'm
okay.
Very basic when it comes to building websites. You can learn more and follow my adventures through Facebook and Civil War Talk, the online Civil War Roundtable, the American Civil War pages. I speak at Civil War Roundtables. I have the full display that involves a 19,000 cubic foot gas balloon that was built by the Navy in 1941 and that was used to transition pilots from lighter than air to airship. But it's similar in size to the smaller balloons that the Union had. And everything else other than its rubberized cotton, everything else about it, the net, the basket, the valve, and the sandbags are the same that was used during the Civil War.
It's amazing to think about all these, just regular stuff? Well, I can only imagine his house. I'm sure you're thinking, don't drop the balloons.
No, it's, I used my body more than 5 people would in a lifetime in my time in the Army, and I'm paying the price with the spinal challenges.
Well, thank you for your service and continued service now in a whole new respect as you're giving us light into a fascinating time period in history. And so on behalf of us here at Virginia Time Travel, we do want to have you take away something certainly near and dear for this time period, our book, Alexandria 1861 to 1865.
Well, thank you so much.
Don't know if there's anything about the balloons in there, but if there is, then who knows where that will help.
Balloons did go aloft in Alexandria. And for your spectators, those who'd like to learn more about the ballooning during the Civil War, the best book for all ages is Gail Jarrow's Lincoln's Flying Spies. It's 107 pages, lots of pictures, but it covers ballooning for both the North and the South. Our Bible, written by F. Stansbury Hayden, military ballooning during the Civil War. Very detailed, and this book was used to teach military historians how to footnote or document their research. A little bit easier read, The War of the Aeronauts by Charles Evans. And if you're into video, I was part of a piece for the History Channel's Man, Moment, and Machine called Lincoln and the Flying Spy Machine, where I take the host aloft in a modern hot air balloon to show his spectators or the viewers what it's like to see from 1,500 to 2,000 feet.
Well, Kevin, it's certainly been a fascinating time talking with you. And this has been Virginia Time Travel, your portal to Commonwealth's past, present, and future, reminding you that when it comes to the air, you might want to look up. You never know what you're going to see. If you see a gas balloon, give them a wave. I think they might appreciate it more than possibly having bullets coming at them. Thanks for watching.